This is, as I said, in preparation for this IAM Weekend event, we co-created a data visualization. And the Munich-based company Itaro supported us in training a neural network. A big thank you to Elias and Johannes from Itaro team for their great support. And when talking about sustainable fashion, there's almost unimaginable claim from the World Bank report from 2019 that the global fashion industry is responsible for 10% of the global CO2 emissions. Owen mentioned that already. That's more than all the air travel and shipping combined. That is a very high number just for fashion. But just as we speak, global leaders and decision makers are meeting with their negotiators at the COP26 summit in Glasgow to try to limit the global warming to a maximum of 1.5 Celsius degrees. This won't be possible without reducing the CO2 consumption. That's why we came up with this idea of displaying a data visualization of CO2 emissions on a digital garment. Our goal was to develop an AI that can predict the worst case scenarios for CO2 emissions in the coming years. To predict or to calculate the future using AI, we had to look to the past. To do this, we decided to use data from the year 1970 onwards, so just after the introduction of the industrial weaving and just before the development of industrial spinning machines. These are the two technologies who made industrial fashion production with its power structures, exploitation of resources and workforces, growth rates and high consumption possible in the first place. The industrial manufacturing of fashion also started in areas like Glasgow, the place where it's been decided right now how livable this planet will be for any living organisms in the long run. Over to Paula now to tell you how we trained the system.
Thank you, Juliane. So the data to be visualized is calculated by an AI. Okay, AI is a very elastic term by which everyone understands something different. In this framework, we want to speak of AI in the sense of machine learning. To do this, we search for suitable data sets, and on the website Kaggle, a kind of Google for data sets, we found a data set containing the columns country, year, and CO2 emissions, i.e. information about the annual CO2 emissions of all individual countries worldwide. From this, I created a new data set containing the annual CO2 emissions worldwide since the beginning of the industrial fashion industry in 1715. This data was entered as input into the machine learning model. Our goal was to create a software that learns the pattern of this data set. Once it learns this, it can apply this pattern to future years and thus predict the outcome for CO2 emissions in subsequent years if the emissions do not change, i.e. a worst case scenario. In collaboration with Elias from Itaro, like Juliane mentioned before, we trained a neural network whose algorithm is based on simple statistical calculations to mimic human learning. After training and optimizing the network, we were able to use it to predict the annual CO2 emissions for the next few years in gigatons, assuming that we humans do not change our behavior and continue to live as we do now. So now to Ashwini.
So we wanted to visualize and communicate the data that Paula researched and built a model for in a really interesting, unique way that has an impact on the layman. So this garment is digitally designed and created and sewn and animated in 3D using Clo 3D. And the results of the AI and the numbers that relate to the amount of carbon emissions at each decade were provided to me by Paula from 1950 through to 2030, which is a predicted amount. The number of lights that you see on the garment represent this data. So starting from 1950, you can see the number of lights increase massively over the decades by the end of the video. The decades that, in fact, we've been around to see. So the emissions that you and I have contributed to with many of our choices, including our fashion choices. So when we play this video again, we want you to take a moment to reflect on that and just watch this visualization and think about your impact and how that can be reduced. As you can see, it starts off with very few red lights and goes on to many, many more.
There we have it.